Welcome everybody to this panel. My name is Héctor Cárdenas. I'm the president of Mexico's Council on Foreign Relations, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this session on Latin America from regional ties to global influence. And we have a fantastic panel today. I want to start by welcoming our guests. First of all, we have Erika Mouynes, and let me start with her. She's a former foreign minister of Panama, who has spent a lot of time working on the very practical side of diplomacy, trade, and regional cooperation. Welcome, Erika. Also, I'm happy to see here Christopher Sabatini. Chris is a senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House, and is one of those voices that consistently pushes us to be more honest about how democracy and cooperation actually work in the region. And very happy also to welcome Ariane Costa. Ariane is deputy director at CEBRI, which is the Brazilian International Relations Institute, and where she works on geopolitics and international trade from a Brazilian and global perspective. So welcome Ariane as well. Rebecca Bill Chavez leads the Interamerican dialogue, or the dialogue, and has been deeply involved for many years in conversations across the Americas about institutions, cooperation, and policy. Welcome, Rebecca. And last but not least, I want to welcome my dear friend Francisco Santibañez, who is president of CARI, the Argentine Institute of, or Council on Foreign Relations, which is an institution that has closely followed and engaged with the evolution of various cooperation mechanisms, including Mercosur, of course, from its very early ambitions to its current challenges. So welcome, Francisco, to this panel. And welcome everybody here as well. Let me begin just by framing the discussion today with a short reflection. Latin America is often invoked in multilateral debates as a region that failed as integration. And if integration is defined narrowly, so if we think of integration per the European Union model, that judgment is hard to escape. But that framing, I think, misses something important, and perhaps that'll be something we can discuss today. Across the region, we have seen some very real cooperation take hold, but on technical, regulatory, and problem-driven issues. Things like customs, payments, logistics, public health, energy interconnection, disaster response, and even some aspects of migration management. These efforts are often quiet, thin, and deliberately non-ideological, but they work. At the same time, grand integration projects, Mercosur, UNASUR, ALBA, CELAC, have repeatedly collided with domestic volatility, ideological swings, and the absence of enforcement mechanisms. Integration became, in essence, an aspiration, sometimes even an identity, but rarely an instrument. This tension, the success of practical cooperation alongside the failures of integration, raises a deeper question that matters beyond Latin America. As we face a world that is pulling back from globalization, from free trade maximalism, and from large-scale institutional commitments, the question remains, are modular, flexible, issue-based arrangements better suited to today's geopolitics? Is Latin America perhaps not a cautionary tale, but a testing ground? A region that has learned, often the hard way, what cooperation looks like when sovereignty is jealously guarded, power is asymmetric, and political cycles are volatile. So today's conversation is not so much about celebrating or lamenting Latin America. It's about interrogating what actually works, where cooperation runs into real limits and hurdles, and what, if anything, can be meaningfully adapted elsewhere. So to do that well, I will invite you, all of our panelists, not just to present your views, but to engage with one another explicitly, and even, well, actually, I hope that you will disagree on some things, that'll make this a lot more interesting for everybody. So let's begin with a simple reality check. So I want to just ask a question to all of you. So beyond EU-style integration, where has Latin America seen cooperation actually deliver results, and why? And let me start with you, Erika. So what have you seen in terms of practical successful efforts at cooperation?
Thank you. I'll give a very narrow, but I think worldwide example. In Latin America, quite a few years ago, we started with the idea of creating a marine protected area that was beyond the waters of one country. In fact, there were 4 countries: Ecuador, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama. This is, to think about it, really difficult to implement, because getting 4 countries to agree on what the water, the conservation, the funding, the illegal fishing, etc. And what we did was focus first on the technical, so get in place governance, technical. We looked for funding, we got, for instance, the UK, Canada, we had several countries funding. So once we had that, then we turned it to the political. And I was among some of the few that went to the presidents and said, let's do this. So you had the technical first, and then you turned it political. It has been a dramatic success. It is the biggest, largest conservation marine area in the world. And it's serving as an example in times when people wonder, are we going to achieve, what do we do with COP, how we achieve all the climate goals? This is a very practical that now other regions are starting to copy. So what can we learn from it? The way to get Latin America to work is not by ideology or getting countries together based on ideology. It's on the opposite. It's on the practical, very narrow, very focused that actually delivers. And then make sure that before you turn it, because you will have to go to the political side. It is impossible to get anything done without getting the buy-in, but you have to have that structure first.
Thank you, Erika. Francisco, let me turn to you now and just ask you, so what other examples do you have of what you think might be successful efforts at cooperation in Latin America?
Argentine and Brazilian experts in a regular way visit each other's nuclear facilities, and to preserve the peaceful use of nuclear technology. And no great powers involved in this, not the US, not the European countries. Later, the Nuclear Energy Agency of the United Nations also got involved. Mm-hmm. And even if there are some difficulties in the relations between Argentina and Brazil, in this area, this collaboration has continued and is considered, as I mentioned, the most successful case in this area. Why it worked? I think it has to do a lot with leadership. Institutions are important, but we used to have a generation of leaders in Latin America, many who have been involved trying for democracy to come back to the region in the 80s, mm-hmm. that have a sense of how important political integration was in Latin America to avoid conflicts. And I think that's a problem we're facing now.
Thank you, Francisco. I want to turn to Ariane now. Maybe you have another example of sort of successful cooperation.
Yes, well,
yes.
Nice. Thank you so much, Héctor, for having us here. Yes, exactly. I agree with you with ABAC. It was actually my first example to bring here as a well-succeeded example of cooperation. And the other one I could say it's OTCA, so the Amazon Treaty Cooperation with the Amazon countries. So both of those examples, OTCA and ABAC, they are both intergovernmental institutions, and that works very well in the reality of Latin America. So it's hard for us to try to shape integration based on European values or European experience. We have our own historic ties in which it's very important for us sovereignty. So sovereignty works not only as a defensive approach, but also as a tool of autonomy. In this regard, we need to think about international integration, thinking on how it can deliver instead of how ideological it is, as Erika has said. So both Ótica and ABAC, they are not sovereignty diluted institutions, but sovereignty assertive institutions. And that has helped a lot for both governments instead of political cycles or ideology that was happened with Mercosur or UNASUR that has changed a lot between political cycles in Latin America.
Thank you, Ariane. So Chris, let me turn to you. So Chris, do you see these as sort of real successes, or are we just overstating them because our expectations are now lower? I mean, how important are these examples of successes in cooperation in Latin America?
So first I want to thank Héctor for inviting me. He also texted me on my flight here and said, I want you to bring the heat and be provocative, so I'm going to do that. So they are all successful, but they all share one thing, is they were technically focused. They were narrow. They, as you mentioned, Erika, they took a technical issue, then made it political and committed. In your case as well, it was about the Amazon. It was about a shared commitment. In your case as well, about denuclearizing the region. All those were specific. But the truth is Latin America is a graveyard of multilateral institutions. I once did a count of all that have been, it was over 20. We're talking the Central American Parliament, the Parlatino, CELAC, UNASUR, Telesur. No, Telesur exists, but it's a propaganda vehicle. Sorry about that. Banco del Sur. Hope you didn't have a savings account in Banco del Sur. It doesn't exist. We can go on and on about all the different failed projects. Why did they fail? They failed primarily because they forgot to do, or they didn't ever intend to do, the basic thing that multilateral institutions are intended to do, which is surrender a certain amount of sovereignty over decision for a broader public good. All of these were intended mostly as just a forum for dialogue and debate. Now, people will say, and Erika, this came up when we were recently in Madrid talking about summits, some people will say dialogue's good no matter what. I actually don't think so. I think empty dialogue cheapens the concept of multilateralism and can even have very adverse effects. Let me just take one example. UNASUR, which doesn't exist anymore, of course. It has a building in Ecuador. It's empty. You can rent it for, I guess, weddings or bar mitzvahs. But in the case of UNASUR, their idea of an election observation was an election accompaniment of the election commission. No observers, no criticism, no judgment. And in 2013, they sent an accompaniment mission to Venezuela, an election that was quite likely stolen, and then walked away. That was a moment when they could have prevented the really tragic things we're seeing right now off the coast of Venezuela. The region had a moment to act, and it dropped the ball tremendously. So just dialogue doesn't always cut it. It actually cheapens it. But I want to add to one other successful example of regionalism, and that's the Interamerican system of human rights, which really is the crown jewel. And again, while countries are leaving, it has done an amazing job of pointing out human rights abuses, tracking democratic reversal, and holding people to account. So another successful example, but a very narrow technical one based on human rights and normative backgrounds.
Thanks, Chris, for getting us into gear that way. and Rebecca, what's your reaction to what you've heard so far?
Surprisingly, I agree with you, Chris. I think I agree with everything that's been said. Héctor, though, first of all, thank you for inviting me. But I do want to remind everyone that it hasn't always been this way. And I'm thinking about this in terms of the Summit of the Americas, which was just postponed. It's 30 years, a little over 30 years since the first Summit of the Americas. And in 1994, at that time, I think there was a lot of optimism about the future of regional cooperation, regional integration. We were even talking about a free trade area of the Americas, which is hard to imagine now. And I think that when I think one of the biggest challenges right now to cooperation in the region is just polarization, fragmentation, because there's polarization, fragmentation within countries, but it's also happening across countries. And Chris, your point about the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is a really good one. But we also have the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which has failed to live up to expectations, and I think that's largely because of this fragmentation, polarization.
Thank you, Rebecca. So this takes us to this question, right? If integration hasn't worked, and what we've been able to do is just focus on fairly narrow technical issues. Now, remember, that's how European integration started, right? But it's been a long time, and so it seems like we have either a very, very long lag, or we're maybe going in the wrong direction. So I'm wondering whether integration was maybe the wrong ambition to begin with, given the political and social and cultural facets in Latin America. So perhaps going back to you, Francisco, you could tell us a little bit about, we heard this morning about Mercosur. There was a panel on Mercosur which painted a fairly rosy picture of Mercosur as a very successful integration effort. What do you see as sort of, from Argentina's experience, what were Mercosur's shortcomings, and where do they stem from? What has it been that's made it difficult for Mercosur to become a more successful integration effort?
Yes, the first thing I will say is there is a consensus, I think, in Mercosur countries that Mercosur is a failure right now. No? It's not working. It's an imperfect custom union that rules are not respected by the different countries, hasn't been able to integrate our economies to the world. Now it seems we may sign an agreement with the European Union, but it will be the first one in its history of certain importance. And so that's the first thing, it has been a failure. But it was not a failure at the beginning. Following the example of the European Union, it was mainly a political agreement between Argentina and Brazil to leave this strategic competition in the past, and that worked for a while. I think there are a couple of things that are important. One is the compatibility between the economies. When Mercosur started, Argentina was a big exporter of commodities. Brazil was a big exporter of industrial goods. So it makes sense for trade between the countries. With China and with Asia as a big market, that has changed. So both Argentina and Brazil export basically commodities and import from other regions of the world. So you don't have an incentive there. And the other reason is what I mentioned before. It has to be with leadership. We don't know each other. And I think this is happening in the region. It's not just the politicians, it's the business community. And we are focused in the US, we are focused in China, and not in our region. And I think that's particularly dangerous right now, and the solution may be fear. No? The big advantage of Latin America right now is we are probably the most peaceful region in the world in terms of conflicts between states. We are by far the most violent one within the countries because of organized crime. We may lose that, basically because of the competition between the US and China and other powers, where Brazil is siding closer to BRICS countries, for instance. Argentina now is moving closer to the US, so you have two superpowers with nuclear weapons that are not going to go to a war, but they will try to solve their issues in other regions. I think that's a major challenge for the region, and maybe the incentive for countries to get closer again and try to coordinate foreign policy, and at least in some major areas, because if we don't do that, we may have conflict back home.
Thank you, Francisco. Ariane, I'd love you to react to that, because I think some analysts have sort of said that Brazil, even though it's paid lip service to this idea of regional integration and cooperation, it's really been much more focused outside of the region in terms of its strategic bets, its long-term strategic bets with China, with BRICS, et cetera. How do you see that? Has Brazil really preferred its autonomy, versus, digging into these kinds of arrangements in Latin America?
Yeah, well, just to add something that Francisco said, I would say that Mercosur was very successful in the point of betterment of the relations between Brazil and Argentina. So to pick that at the crisis that we had and the rivalry between Brazil and Argentina in the 70s. So in this point of view, Mercosur was very successful, and the challenges were basically the different political cycles in which, depending on the administration, on the federal administration, they would put more efforts on Mercosur or not, and depending on the realm. So during the pink tide, during the 2000s, there was a Mercosur more political than economical. So to answer your question, from Brazil's standpoint, historically, we have our back turned away from Latin America. We had been a player from the Atlantic, first to Europe, then to the United States, and now to the Global South, always thinking about overseas instead of Latin America. But there is a contradiction in this foreign policy in which you need to have a very strong region and to have a strong ties as a regional leader here before you go to the global stage. And as Professor Andres Malamud said, Brazil for a while was a leader without followers. And it was trying to be the vocal point of Latin America without talking to Latin American countries before that. So this is something that I would like to consider for the Brazilian foreign policy still nowadays.
Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting. So I've said in different fora that I'm not sure that Latin America exists in the sense that you have different sub-regions that are, quite distinctive. I mean, Mexico and Central America, very much tied to the United States economically, in terms of investments, etc. You've got obviously the Caribbean, which is its whole other entity. Then you have the Andean countries. You've got the Southern Cone. And then you've got Brazil, which is almost a continent in and of itself. So, Rebecca, I wanted to turn it over to you. Is this just a matter of geography, or is there something else that's to blame for the lack of progress? Is it lack of political will? Is it institutional designs that perhaps have asked states to do much more than they're willing to do? What do you think is at the root of this?
I think you make an excellent point about the fact that the region is not monolithic. I think there are many do not see that. So I think that that's important to keep in mind. I do think, though, right now the biggest hindrance is polarization, and it's ideological, which is why I think Erika's point about finding, I think what the most we can expect right now is to find areas of cooperation that are not tied to a particular ideology. And the good news is that there are plenty of those. I mean, so many of the challenges that face our hemisphere transcend borders, and by definition, no single country can address it on its own. One that I'll mention is Francisco, what you were talking about. We live in a zone of peace, but within countries, insecurity is one of the top concerns, if not the top concern of many. We see this in recent elections. We saw this in the election in Chile, for example. But Latin America and the Caribbean have the world's highest regional homicide rate, but it also has the highest proportion that's related to organized crime. Organized crime, transnational organized crime, is something that I think it's imperative. This is something I think the region, there is a possibility for the region to come together. There's not sufficient intelligence sharing. There's not, the countries thus far have failed to, in a kind of strategic, long-term way, to come together to identify what the challenges are, in addition, how to address them. And I think there was hope that at the summit, which was supposed to be taking place now, pretty much now, that security would have been one of the main themes. But it's a challenge everywhere. I mean, it's a challenge in the United States. It's something that I really hope we can get over ideological differences and work together on.
Right. I think that's a really good segue. I wanted to ask you, Erika, Rebecca talked about polarization, political polarization, and how that is having an impact on the region. And we've seen, for example, perhaps one of the most successful efforts was the Alliance for the Pacific. And that basically has broken down because of differences between the constituent countries. But today, Latin American countries, I'm thinking of Panama to begin with, we're sort of facing a multiplicity of issues, right? We're facing, a much more aggressive U.S. we just saw the release of the National Security Strategy, which talks about, a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, Panama has been a victim of this with the whole trouble around the Panama Canal. You've got migration that's coming through the Darien area, and at the same time, you've got this polarization. So, isn't this the moment that Latin American countries have to talk to each other in order to sort of, face all of these issues? What do you think? Where are we there? And is there any chance of us breaking down this polarization to be able to have a more united front?
I think the key is actually to move away from the hope of, we need all countries to talk to each other, because we have leaders that sit at very opposite views, and get back to the practical. There are two main things that are sort of transversal for the entire region. One was mentioned here, and that's crime. If you go in through any of the polls, organized crime that, petty theft, whatever it is, crime is an issue where most countries are concerned. And the second one is money. The cost of living, investment, the lack of foreign direct investment, and that everybody's desperate because all politicians want jobs. They want numbers. And so I think that rather than having an approach and add to the graveyard of new initiatives of let's come together and hold hands and face the world, be much more practical. I am involved in a new initiative a white paper that will be delivered to the presidents with the new summit of next year, the Interamerican summit, on investment. And this is why I think it's interesting. Every single president that I've encountered when they come in the first day, they have wonderful new ideas, and most of them never materialize. Because investors, they don't fund ideas, they fund projects. So we're building together pockets of bankable projects. And that is not one country, because we're doing pockets for critical minerals, we're doing one for water, we're doing one for energy. What I think is interesting is it doesn't matter where the president or the government sits, whether it's the left or the right, they both want money. So if we can get them involved and behind this sort of templates that we need, because at the end, you need to go through the financial feasibility, the environmental, like everything. It's not an idea. So it's not to come to a forum and have a new president say, I've come and I've decided to do, a port, but rather this strategic, very structure that I think cuts through the ideology and sits a little bit more on the what do we want. And frankly, as you mentioned at the beginning, the grandiose ideas of multilateralism and sort of greater agreements is not where the world is going. So let's just stick with that trend and in sort of the micro and very specific and get goal-oriented, because at the end, you want these projects to go through administrations. You don't want this to be, a Petro, for instance, project. You want to be a Colombian and Ecuador project, for instance. So in order to do that, you need to cut through the ideology and stick to sort of the nitty-gritty, the goal-oriented, or the focus that you want.
Thanks, Erika. So, Chris, let me take it back to you now. What Erika's talking about requires fairly capable states, right? It requires, you talked about crime, for example. I mean, the record isn't great in terms of state capability to fight crime. So you need capable states, you need political will, How do you see the region in that sense? I mean, what are the assets that, that some of these countries have in terms of capacity and political desire to get these things done?
I think the desire is there, certainly at a popular level. If we look at the issue of crime, if we look at the issue of investment, one of the things, by the way, that the region is always underinvested in is in regional infrastructure, cross-border infrastructure. That's in part why the Pacific Alliance started to crumble, as you mentioned, Hector. These are real issues that require technical responses, and that there is that capacity within Latin America to do it and to tackle it. And these are, again, technical, specific interests or issues in the national interest that could sustain meaningful integration. I would say also that, if you can dedicate the Interamerican Development Bank is made up of Latin Americans. It works perfectly fine. It's not like it's not in their DNA. I think it's a question of finding the proper technocrats and the political will and isolating them in a way above sort of the political volatility of the moment to be able to carry out a set of tasks in the national or mutual interests of all these countries. Because the truth is when that doesn't occur, Latin America is weakened. So I'll just give one example. I was in 2023, I was in Brussels after the CELAC EU meeting. At the time, the country that had the rotating presidency was St. Vincent's and the Grenadines. And I spoke to one of the EU diplomats. I can't say who it was because I'm under Chatham House rule all the time. I worked there. And basically the EU diplomat was like, it was useless. I mean, it was useless. It was 30-some countries, states there trying to talk to the EU, a grand variety of no common agenda. It was a waste of time. But yet it still limps along. Again, if these countries could come together on the issue, let's take crime and insecurity, intelligence sharing in a meaningful way, it would allow them also to push back, and I'm going to sound anti-Trump here, but on the threats that were evident in the National Security Strategy document, but also occurring off the coast of Venezuela, off the coast of Colombia and Ecuador, which is having the U.S. dictate what it wants to do by killing alleged narco-terrorists. It would allow them not to have to be picked off one by one, that's no pun intended on the boats, but on the individual countries. They could start to dictate the terms of that security cooperation far better than they're doing now if they're collectively organized rather than being atomized as they are.
Right. But doing sort of, that sort of size of collective action has a really big problem, which is that anybody has a veto, right? Even if it's not formally so, but you have to have this dialogue, and you don't have that consensus within the region. I mean, you have at least 4 or 5 countries that are never going to agree with the rest, right? Yes.
I don't know if this is directed to me, but I'll answer it
Yes.
anyway. Look, I think to create a meaningful multilateral organization, you have to offer benefits that matter. You have to have standards. That club has to be meaningful and attractive. And so if you begin to gather, let's say, forgive the joke, a coalition of the willing that actually is addressing what is the primary concern of citizens across Latin America, as all of you are saying, and it shows results, and other countries are going to want to sign up. You don't sort of decide the borders simply by geography. You decide them by who's willing to put some real skin in the game and make it happen and monitor that. And then once you see that, you'll start to see other countries wanting to join in. You start small, not just on the theme, but even in the club.
Rebecca, I'm going to put you on the spot. So which do you see you look at the whole region, where do you see the countries that are willing to make that effort to become part of that coalition of the willing, as Chris says? Do you see any takers?
I do. I see Mexico as one. I see several Central American countries. I see, Ecuador right now is cooperating in ways it had not before with Peru, and even the cooperation with Colombia continues. I would say Chile, Argentina, Uruguay's now just releasing its national security strategy, which is very, very interesting because it provides sort of an alternative to the Bukele model, which I think is something that many countries are looking for. So I don't think there's a shortage of countries. I think Brazil, I know in Lula's call with Trump, they talked about security. So that's one of the reasons I think that this issue is one that can bring the countries together, because the leaders are talking about it, and they're also finding that if they are not going to deliver security, they're going to lose their jobs. And the impact on the economy, it's 3.4% of GDP on average that crime costs the countries of the region. So I do see takers, or I do see a potential for a nascent coalition around this issue.
Ariane, maybe go back to you. And so how do you see Brazil's role here, or just enlarging on what Rebecca was saying, do you see also, potential allies there?
Yes, I was basically going to ask her, where's Brazil on the list? But no, she ended up saying it. So I'd like to bring it here because there is a selective approach to regionalism from Brazil's side. And as you said, we are thinking about like global leadership, and we had in the last 12 months the G20, the BRICS presidency, plus the COP30 last month. So there is step by step going to this administration in Brazil trying to reach this global leadership, but right now, because of the Trump/Marco Rubio administration, we have to face back the challenges of the region. And there was a survey from the University of São Paulo that showed us that 80% of Brazilians saw ourselves as Westerns, so apart from the West, but only 8%, 8% saw ourselves as Latin Americans. So I think that answers a lot of our selective approach to regionalism, but now we need a wake-up call to go back to the region and go back to its challenges once Brazil has the potential to negotiate, to has a little bit of leverage to help in many sectors. In one of them, security. So we also have a lot of problems in security inside, and it's a transnational problem. So we need to talk to each other about that, and we need to prevent extra major powers acting in our region to solve the problems that we can solve ourselves.
Thanks. Yes, sure.
Thinking about this too. One of the growing markets for cocaine is Europe. And I would venture a bet that if countries were to come together with a serious plan for intra-regional cooperation on security and narcotics and transnational crime, the European Union would be willing to put a lot of money into that. And it'd be more effectively spent than targeting individual countries, because it would share, and I'm sure there'd be plenty of technical assistance the European Union would also be able to share. So just a thought in terms of the push to get it happening. Money does matter, and I think that could be of interest.
Absolutely. Francisco, your reaction to that also, and in terms of, both to the last question about, what is the role, for example, that Argentina can play, especially now with your president and his sort of ideological alignment with the Trump administration? Is there a role there for Argentina as part of these groups of countries that could work on these kinds of issues?
I hope so. Basically, what's happening now, I think, is we're having elections in Latin America, so you are having more conservative leaders winning elections. Chile is going to happen, and maybe in Colombia, maybe in Peru and other nations. I think that's a challenge because we may have a series of conservative governments that would more alike to Milei's government, something that has not happened until now. And if leaders are not able to overcome the ideological differences, it will be very difficult to start a process of integration. And again, it's very important not just to focus on political leaders, the business community, civil society in general, in a time where leaders, not just in Latin America, but in many other places, are focused on short-term issues, should be focusing more in building bridges between the countries. So it's very important, the role of think tanks, universities, and the business communities in this process. Something that we usually do in Latin America is to blame the politicians and don't get involved. But I think there is a lot to do from our part too.
Right, so organizations like ours have a role in identifying those opportunities, right? And one of the things that some of you mentioned right now is this convergence of regional cooperation and extra-regional cooperation. Chris was talking about that just now. Brazil, for example, has very, very strong ties with the Global South that you've been developing. Is that an avenue for maybe bringing the rest of Latin America along with you, or is this just something that Brazil does on its own?
I hope it is as a bridge to the Latin American as well. So Brazil sees itself as a bridge with BRICS and the West. Also, I would like to add Latin America, so Brazil bringing the region within to as a bridge builder. So basically, thinking about Lula's last speech on UNGA this September, he said the 21st century will be increasingly multipolar. To remain peaceful, it must be multilateral as well. So the vision we have of multipolarity nowadays is a multipolarity that can be multilateral. So we need to bring the region with us. We need to, not in the way that Brazil will be the leader to bring the region, but in the way that we will talk to each other, we will cooperate. And BRICS can be one of the channels in which we do that, but I'm a little bit skeptical about BRICS itself. But in any way that we can bring dialogue and bring cooperation, we should be in. We should be as a voice and a speaker of the region.
Erika, you mentioned sort of, your work in very specific types of initiatives, and I wonder maybe we can use this to sort of close out the panel and then get some questions. If you had to think about a program of action to bring about greater cooperation and to make the types of cooperation that have been successful in the past, more prevalent, where would you start? What are the 2 or 3 things that you would work on?
I'll start actually disagreeing slightly with Adrienne and then saying back to your question. I don't see Brazil pushing towards BRICS or other initiatives and Latin American following, i.e. countries. I think that there are plenty of countries I can think of which are almost allergic to the idea of BRICS or that type of cooperation. So I don't think that the avenue is to have, or it could be the opposite. It could be a Milei with a very conservative approach that the others are also not comfortable. But I don't think that in itself is a problem. I just don't think that is the avenue. I go back to my initial idea that it is much more narrow and specific because we continue to share the same problems. So we've talked a lot about crime and organized crime and that being something that is not that it's sort of like, well, maybe I'm in or maybe I'm not. If you start seeing results in other countries of the numbers going down, you're immediately going to get interested. But you can't start macro, you can't start national level. There are interventions at a community level that end up being successful. Like one simple example are prisons. Prisons throughout Latin America are a problem. And starting with one and then showing that and getting funding, which I think Chris alluded to. See, other countries want to see not just the idea, but that you got funding. And then, so I think it's a much more strategic and disciplined than rather sort of this grandiose, more ideologically, or see, in the dichotomy of between the US and China, one country can want to align with one. It's a zero-sum game, and I don't think that is the avenue for Latin American countries to come together. So I think I would stay away from whatever sounds or looks like these hard choices, geopolitical choices, and continue being more practical. So one, as I mentioned, trying to find ways or avenues, discipline and structure for funding. It's critical, and every single president will be behind that idea because they want money. The crime is another one, but there's several that are sort of transversal, but you can't start like all Latin American countries are joining hands. It has to be specific, and it has to be fundable.
Thank you. Chris, same question. What topics would you work on?
Again, I think the big one, obviously, is again, security and crime. And I think, again, money and success are strong incentives. Again, you mentioned, Hector, the case of how the EU started. It was actually the Benelux countries and France and Germany over a very small, shared economic set of resources. Start in the same way. The truth is transnational crime is transnational. Security measures are not really so much transnational. Mm-hmm. So you need to make the response transnational. So that's the first thing. And then I think, again, if you were to create something that had the backing of the EU, and I don't know if the US would come along, it obviously wants to, we know from the security strategy document, it wants to own the hemisphere, it wants to perpetuate the Donroe Doctrine, as it's now been coined. But I think it's one area. I think the other area is even improving licit commerce, legal commerce between some of these countries. There just isn't much intra-regional commerce. Part of that is because the comparative advantages are all the same. But I think that can help shape part of this. And then again, to tee off what Erika said too about investment opportunities, we are here in Qatar. There's I think a very refreshing and inspiring sense of interest from the GCC countries about investing in the region. And I think, to the extent that the region can offer, rather than competing among themselves necessarily for the prizes, is actually trying to offer up some serious projects that would be of interest with big returns that would be of regional returns. And I'm thinking specifically about infrastructure, perhaps also in security and those sorts of areas. But the truth is right now the only model we have that's successful is Nayib Bukele's. And we all know that comes with a lot of risks. Mm-hmm. And so the truth is the left in Latin America has failed to come up with a good response for security. And I think now it's time to vest that responsibility in some that's transnational and a shared commitment, not just among the countries, but also of where drugs and the transnational crime reside, but also in the consuming countries. We need to recognize their responsibility in this as well.
Thank you. Ariane, your sort of closing thoughts on what should be the direction and what should be Brazil's role?
So I would say food security, energy transition, and climate change. So we need to work with our assets, and those are not only assets from Brazil, but also from the region. So Latin America is very important. It's a core for the world in those three themes. So I also congratulate a lot COMEXI and you for bringing Latin America panel to Doha Forum.
Thank you, Ariane. Thank you. Rebecca.
So we recently launched a security initiative at the Dialogue because of our belief that this is something that the countries of the region can come together on. But I do want to just your point about Bukele is an important one, because that model has taken on, that's taken on a life in the region. I know there's the elections in Chile, there's many people were talking about the Bukele model. First of all, there are questions about the rule of law when it comes to the very basic fundamental questions, but also is that strategy that works in El Salvador at all applicable to a country like Chile, even if you did believe in it. It's a very different problem set. So I think when we think about hemispheric cooperation on security, we need to look at enforcement, things like intel sharing, but we also need to think about the other side, prevention, and what countries are doing and sharing best practices on that side, recognizing that this is not just an enforcement problem, a big part of it, but it's also about addressing the root causes of insecurity.
Thank you, Rebecca. Francisco, you get the last word.
Just a few words. I think we haven't mentioned physical integration. It's quite important. Energy is becoming a major issue, and there is a lot of opportunities in terms of integration. Everything that has to do with new technologies. And basically, I agree what has been said. No? We don't have to be too ambitious. We have to avoid the ideology. We have to find a couple of themes. One is crime, but I think the other one is first physical and energy, physical integration and energy.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's get some questions. I think you had your hand up first. And then I'll do 3 questions on this side, and then we'll come to this side, if you don't mind. So, and Andres, and then over here. And please let us know if you're directing it to somebody in particular, who you're directing it to.
Thank you so much. My name is Gustavo Alegret. I'm an international journalist and political analyst. First words to congratulate for the moderation and raising the right topics in this panel. Thank you. Two questions very quick. The first one for Christopher. You mentioned about the U.S. relation with Latin America, and particularly with Venezuela. But we hear and we saw what happened in the Honduran elections this past weekend with the full pardon of the former drug dealer president, what happened in Argentina, what happened in Ecuador. How do you think is going to change this presidency, the relation between the U.S. and Latin America? And the second question is for Erika and Rebecca regarding to the Summit of the Americas. The previous Summit of the Americas, it was very controversial because the U.S. decided not to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And the difference between the countries in the region were so evident. Now, differences rose again, and the government decided to cancel the summit. Is the summit dead? Is diplomacy from the U.S. to Latin America in danger? Thank you.
Thank you. Andres?
Yeah, Andrés Rugeles, Vice President of the Colombian Council of Foreign Affairs. More than questions, I have some comments, and let me make 3 brief comments. The first one, I do agree with Francisco Santibañez about the importance of the role of the think tanks in the region. And I think the CARI, CEBRI, COMEXI, CORI, Colombia have a very important role to play in order to generate new ideas and also to promote public debate and to give recommendations to the governments in order to advance in the regional integration. The second one is about institutions. We have been talking about a lot governments, but I think there are some multilateral institutions as CAF that is playing a very important role in the region, and we should highlight those institutions that have been a very positive impact as CAF. CAF is a multilateral development bank, more than 50 years in the region, and it has a very high impact on key areas in the region, such as infrastructure, transport, energy, environment, social issues. And the third one is, I think that the biggest challenge for the region at this moment is how we can build our own Latin American way of development and also of international insertion. And this is the way, or this is the path in which we should think about the international insertion of the region.
Thank you.
We know that there are differences. We have seen here the difference. Some prefers to look north, other ones to look south, but we have to have a common ground in order to proceed.
Thank you. One more question over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Kevin Vargas from the Embassy of Panama. The title of this session is Latin America, from regional ties to global influence. One of the most influential roles in the world is coming up for election, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And it's our region's turn. There are many profiles already, many people putting their names forward. It's an open question, just eager to hear from you about the profile, who is the person, or what skills this person should have, and how this person can represent our bloc and influence in this polarizing world that we live in.
Thank you. Let's start with answers. Maybe we start with Chris and then go to the others.
Yes, the Trump administration is definitely throwing a monkey wrench into regional relations, to put it nicely. Whether it's openly intervening in elections, sanctioning an independent court justice in the case of Brazil for trying a friend of Trump's, or a mini-me Trump, actually, it's probably better put. They will continue. If you look at the National Security Strategy document, which you mentioned, Gustavo, they're going to continue to try to intervene, which is why I think it's all the more important the countries in the regions try to bond together. to take the initiative. I was recently in Spain and speaking in the case of Venezuela policy. European foreign ministries are also just kind of watching this train wreck, not knowing what to do. There are no alternatives. And I like to think, and I'm going to show my age here, that in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was implementing a policy in Central America that eventually forced the Contador process that actually brought those civil conflicts to an end, thanks in part because of the collapse of the Soviet Union too. But I think out of this extremism, there can be, and there's a need for, a much more moderate position. And there's a strong incentive for countries to come together, not just in Latin America, but also in Europe and other places to try to address that and provide a more, let's say, a more moderate response to real needs. On the issue of the UN, I think the UN, the Secretary General will have to be able to maintain good relations with the United States, but is also going to have to basically oversee a UN Security Council that's deeply paralyzed right now. We saw this in the case of Haiti with Russia and China basically voting down any sort of peacekeeping mission. So, this was always true that the Secretary General had to be politically habile. I think it's even more true now. But I think it is important that it's someone from the global south. I think Latin America is in a good position to do it, but I don't think that should be dictated by the Trump administration.
Some reactions to the questions. Anybody want to take another one? Do you want to answer?
Sure.
Okay.
On the CAF point, I fully agree. They're being a positive, reinvigorating force for the region that it is sometimes not mentioned enough, so I agree. On the point of Summit of the Americas and the invitations, I said it before and I continue thinking that the non-guests or the non-invitations create more hassle, drama, and attention, and then hijacks the entire process. So I think it's actually a terrible idea to disinvite, and some of the most successful ones, one being in Panama, everybody was invited at the table. The fact that you invite somebody at the table does not mean that you agree with his views or her views. That's the exact point of how the United Nations were created. So I think we're missing the mark in the continuous idea of not inviting certain authorities and inviting others. On the point of the UN, I am of the belief, as many others, that it has to be a woman finally, a woman from Latin America. But on the point on what's going through the UN and on the character of the candidates, which there are several right now, if you don't recognize that the UN is paralyzed and people no longer believe in the institution because it has deep faults, all the way from the Security Council to how decisions are taken, that's a problem. So you do need somebody that is courageous enough and politically savvy, because this is at the end a political institution, and you will need the buy-in of several to even embark on the kind of change that the United Nations needs.
Yes, just 1 minute. No, I think the election of the Secretary for the UN is an example of Latin America not working together. Because if you take the example of Africa, they agree on a candidate in different elections in multilateral organizations, and they go together. This is not going to be the case again. There are different candidates. My only point would be, we don't have to forget that this is basically a job for someone who will have to deal with international security crisis. No, that's a big issue, and I think those who are going to take a decision are the 5 permanent members of the Security Councils, and they will focus mostly in those big issues of today.
So just maybe Rebecca and Ariane, did you want to add something in response to these comments, and then we'll close?
I just very briefly on the Summit of the Americas question. I fear that I would say that the Los Angeles Summit was a missed opportunity in many ways. The LA Declaration on the Rights of Migrants, I think, was something, but I think when the discussion is all about who's invited and who's not invited, it becomes potentially one of those dialogues that Chris described at the beginning. It's just a conversation. it's just a one and done event, and nothing comes out of it.
Thank you. Ariane, do you want to close?
Just on the role of think tanks in the region that was brought by CARI here. So we have a lot of food for thought here in this panel, and also a lot of homework to do. So we need to integrate our Latin American think tanks for international relations and thinking what's the minimum consensus we have so we can start an advocacy in order to tackle the challenges our region has.
Well, I mean, that sounds like a really good way to end. Well, I'll give you just one last question. Yes, go ahead. 'Cause we're over time. Yeah, we are over time. Okay, we're over time. I'm just going to close, and then we can talk informally because the sí. Sí. Sí, okay. Okay. Muy. Muy bien. Muy bien. Gracias. Thank you very much for that comments. Thanks everybody, and we have our work cut out for us in bringing these ideas together. Thank you again. Thanks.